He is known by many names, and he is the most iconic villain in Tolkien's world, the Lord of the Rings, or more commonly known as Sauron. But how did he rise to power in the Second Age? In his attempt to conquer all of Middle-earth, he would not simply declare outright war, but also manipulate and deceive his enemies. Today on Council of the Rings, we'll explore the fascinating story of Sauron in the Second Age. Our story begins at the end of the First Age. Sauron's master Morgoth have just suffered a humiliating defeat in the War of Wrath. Morgoth is forever imprisoned in the Void, and his former servants flee and hide in the corners of Middle-earth. Some, like the Balrogs, hide at the dark roots of the earth, while orcs flee from Angband towards the northern waste. Sauron has quite a different start of the Second Age, however. After the war, Sauron adopted a fair form and repented his evil deeds in fear of the wrath of the Valar. Manwë's banner-bearer and herald, Eönwë, had led the host of the West during the war and met Sauron. He ordered him to return to Valinor in order to receive the judgment of Manwë. But Sauron would not suffer such humiliation and instead fled and hid in Middle-earth. It is not known where he went, but everything seems to indicate he went east at some point. Around 500 years into the Second Age, Sauron began to stir again. He was convinced the Valar had turned a blind eye to Middle-earth again, so he planned his vengeance upon the elves and the allies of the Valar, and to continue his master's work and become the new Dark Lord. He starts in the east and south of the world by corrupting many men that had already been corrupted by Melkor long ago. They quickly fell under his shadow and served him blindly. During Eldarian's explorations of Middle-earth, he encounters some of these men that secretly served under the Dark Lord. On Eldarian's 6-year voyage, between 863 to 869, it's said that the men of the coasts were growing afraid of the Numenorians, and some became outright hostile. Eldarian even heard rumors of a lord in Middle-earth that hated the Numenorians and their ships. When Eldarian tried to sail back home, a great wind came from the south, and the ships were borne far to the northward. He tarried for a while in Grey Havens before he set sail again. As he tried to return to Numenor, a wind once again swept the ship north, and they were carried off to perilous waters full of ice and cold. The bow of Oiolaire on the prow had withered, which is likely the reason for this ill fortune. But it is possible that Sauron played a part in these treacherous winds. We know he had such powers at least. Eldarian would inform Gil-galad on these rumors, but both Gil-galad and Galadriel had suspected the worst when they first knew of the growing shadow in the east. This led to Gil-galad writing a letter to the king of Numenor, Tar Minaldur, in 882 of the Second Age. A new shadow arises in the east. It is no tyranny of evil men, as your son believes, but a servant of Morgoth is stirring, and evil things awake again. He begs the king for help and aid from the Numenorians. War is upon their doorstep, and Gil-galad fears the elves unaided can't defeat this rising darkness. While he does not name this shadow to Tar Minaldur, it's clear that Gil-galad at this point has realized it's Sauron behind this growing evil. The war Gil-galad fears doesn't break out, however, though we don't know exactly why. Maybe Sauron's plans was delayed due to the Numenorians in their explorations. Around 1000 Second Age, Sauron is alarmed by the growing power of the Numenorians, so he withdraws himself and his influence from the coasts and comes to Mordor, a dark and accursed land where the volcano of Uradruin once had been created by Morgoth himself. A perfect land for Sauron to build his stronghold and spread terror into Middle-earth. The construction of barad-dur begins, but it would take 600 years to finish. Although Sauron long knew that the men were easier to sway, he sought to bring the elves into his service, as they were far more powerful. Instead of countering the Numenorians, Sauron devised a new plan, aimed towards the elves of Eriador. He sent out emissaries to Lindon, but they are all dismissed by Gil-galad, that perceived the evil they brought with them. This setback in his plans leads him to take matters into his own hands. For 200 years, Sauron lay hidden in Mordor and increased his power in secret. Finally, in 1200, his master plan as a deceiver comes into play. He takes his fair form and travels to Eriador to trick the elves. He styles himself Annatar, the Lord of Gifts. He came before the elves and claimed to be an emissary of the Valar sent to help them. But in Lindon he was never welcome, as Elrond and Gil-galad did not trust him and refused to treat with him, although they did not perceive who he truly was. Elsewhere, Annatar was gladly received by the elves, especially in Eregion, where only Galadriel distrusted him. The Noldor's myth of Eregion especially welcomed him and his talents. The elven master craftsmen of Eregion were called Gwaith y Myrdain, the Brotherhood of Jewelsmiths. The founder of this order was Lord Celebrimbor, son of Corofin and grandson of Fëanor. From Annatar they learned much in art and magic, and their thirst for knowledge was great. Under the tutelage of Annatar and the leadership of Celebrimbor, the Gwaith y Myrddin became more skilled than anyone save Fëanor himself. Sauron had once been a servant of Aule, the smith of the Valar. Back then, Sauron was known as Mairan, and it said he was deemed mighty and surpassed only by Aule himself in crafting. Many of these skills Sauron, as Annatar, would teach to the Gwaith y Myrddin. The greatest in skill among them would be Celebrimbor, that would be known as the second greatest smith in the history of Middle-earth, only surpassed by his grandfather Fëanor. In the year 1500 Second Age, when the Gwaith y Myrddin reached the height of their power, the elves began the forging of the Rings of Power, which according to Annatar would help them preserve their realms and powers in Middle-earth. For 90 years, the elves forged both lesser rings and 16 Rings of Power. By this time, Annatar departed for Mordor, though no one in the region knew where he was headed. Celebrimbor was ignorant of Annatar's true intentions, and he was unaware that he was indeed Sauron in disguise, that had incorporated a binding magic into the rings. But while Sauron returned home to Mordor, Celebrimbor crafted 3 elven rings, Naya, Ninja, and Vilja, which Sauron didn't know of. In 1600, Sauron finalized his plans. In the fires of Mount Doom, he forges in secret a master ring to dominate all the others and in the darkness bind them. He invested most of his own power into the ring as he forged it, so that it would be more powerful than the others.
Ashnask Turbatuluk, Ashnask Kimbatul, Ashnask Trakatuluk, Akbursum Isi Krimbatul.
One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and into darkness bind them. With its power, he first completed the building of barad-dur. He bound the very foundations of the Dark Tower to the One Ring. But the elves were not so easily ensnared, and as soon as Sauron put on the One Ring, they heard his voice, and Celebrimbor were aware of him, and realized they had been betrayed. Annatar's true identity was revealed. Aside from the One Ring, the greatest rings were the 3 elven rings created by Celebrimbor, and these were never touched by Sauron, and thus were uncorrupted by him. Although they were still subject to the One Ring, he sent the 3 rings away for safekeeping. Vilja and Naya to Gil-galad in Lindon, and Ninja to Galadriel in Lorien. In one version of the story, the Ring of Naya is given to Círdan by Gil-galad right away, while in another version, he would first give it to him when they departed during the War of the Last Alliance. The remaining rings were hid from Sauron, and the elves did not use them. Sauron demanded that the other rings were given to him, for they would not have been made without his knowledge. The elves refused, and the war was inevitable, and thus began the War of the Elves and Sauron. Sauron began by constructing the Black Gate of Mordor to prevent invasion, and then he raised the massive armies of orcs, trolls, and men, chiefly Easterlings and Haradrim, whom he dominated as king and god. He had them make many fortified towns, and arm those under him with iron weapons, tools, and armor. He obtained the allegiance of men that lived in the lands that were adjacent to Mordor, including the regions of the White Mountains and in Calenathan. The Numenorians who occupied Anduin and the coasts of Lebanon discovered his activities and informed Gil-galad about them. His armies of Easterlings he remained secretly in the east, as he would not reveal his full force until he was ready. But not all of the Easterlings followed Sauron without opposition, and some resisted. This was possibly the work of the Blue Wizards, who in one version are described to have opposed Sauron's plans in the east and south. Otherwise, it said the forces of the east would have outnumbered those of the west in the Second Age, and later in the Third Age during the War of the Ring. This setback meant that it took Sauron longer than expected to muster all his armies. In 1695, Sauron began his great invasion of Eriador. His vast armies passed through Calenathan and invaded Eriador and turned north to attack Eregion. Thanks to the Numenorians, having cut down many of the trees of Minhiriath and Enedwaith, the men that dwelled in these lands welcomed Sauron's conquest and let him pass without hindrance. Sauron left a force at Tarbat and would lead the remaining force against Eregion. Celeborn led a force from Eregion and would defeat the first wave of Sauron's army. However, he could not hold them indefinitely, and they were overwhelmed and driven back to Ostin-Ithil, the capital of Eregion. When the news of the invasion arrived to Gil-galad, he sent a force commanded by Elrond from Lindon to reinforce Eregion, as well as send word to Numenor for aid. Elrond's forces were held back by Sauron's greater host, and Eregion was devastated. In Second Age, 1697, Ostin-Ithil fell, with Celebrimbor himself leading a last desperate defense on the steps of the House of the Myrddin. He was taken captive by the orcs, and the Dark Lord demanded that the Rings of Power be turned over to him, as well as the 3 rings. Celebrimbor was captured in the chaos and was forced under torture to disclose the location of the lesser rings, but he would not reveal the whereabouts of the 3. Celebrimbor died from his torment, and his body was shot with arrows and hung upon a pole, and was later paraded as a banner at the head of Sauron's legions. Elrond's force was far smaller compared to Sauron's army. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm, along with Galadhrim led by Amroth, attacked the rearguard of Sauron's forces. As Sauron turned to face these new adversaries, Elrond gathered the few survivors of Eregion and led them along the Bruinen to establish the refuge of Imladris, more commonly known as Rivendell. Among these survivors were also Celeborn. While Elrond and his host escaped, Sauron pushed the elves and dwarves back into Khazad-dûm, where they sealed the doors of Durin. In Osten Ethil, he gathered up the Rings of Power that remained. Then he laid waste to the land of Eregion, bringing an end to its people. The surviving elves seem to have scattered, as there are various accounts of their fates. Some fled northward to join Elrond's host, while others tried to make their way to Lindon. The forces of the elves were pushed back almost to the Blue Mountains. Sauron was furious to see how the dwarves had aided the elves in the war, and sent a great force of orcs and Easterlings into the Vales of Anduin. Many of the Easterlings fought the Northmen that lived in the area, while the orcs sacked Mount Gundabad further north. As a result, the Grey Mountains were infested with orcs, and communication between Khazad-dûm and the Iron Hills was cut off. The dwarves remained behind their walls after that, and would do little more in the war. The Numenorians had responded early on to Gil-galad's plea for aid, and gathered forces and supplies in Lindon, where they were welcomed. The war raged on, and Eriador was overrun by Sauron's forces, and they moved west, aiming to take Lindon and claim 1 or more of the 3 rings. By Second Age, 1699, Eriador and all his lands were overrun, save Imladris and Lindon. However, Rivendell was under siege, and Gil-galad was barely holding the line, along with the Numenorians. Minastir, nephew to Queen Telperion, sent a great navy under the command of Kirjatur to aid the elves, but it was delayed and first reached the coast of Middle-earth in 1700. The great armament of Minastir came in the very nick of time to save them. There was a great slaughter at Sarn Ford, the crossing of the Brandywine River. Sauron was driven back south, where he planned to regroup with his remaining forces in Tarbad, but he was tricked by the Admiral Kirjatur once again, as he had sent part of the forces to land at the mouth of Gwathlo. As Sauron tried to regroup, he was once again attacked by the Numenorians from the rear. This battle became known as the Battle of Gwathlo. Sauron was routed utterly, and he himself narrowly escaped. His small remaining force was assailed in the east of Calenathan, and he, with no more than a bodyguard, fled to the region afterwards called Dagorlad. Whence broken and humiliated, he returned to Mordor and vowed vengeance upon Numenor, those that had robbed him of his ultimate victory. The army that was besieging Imladris was caught between Elrond and Gil-galad and utterly destroyed. Eriador was cleared of the enemy, but lay largely in ruins. Nonetheless, while Sauron's subsequent power never quite matched the height it had during the war with the elves, the homeland of its most powerful enemies had still been devastated. As the Numenorians established dominions around the Westlands around 1800, Sauron's empire continued to expand to dominate other men as servants and worshippers to the far south and east. As the elves had failed him, he had decided to distribute the Rings of Power to men, great kings, sorcerers, and warriors. 3 were given to corrupt lords of Numenor, one of which would later be known as the Witch King. Another ring was given to an Easterling king, later known as Camul. Another 5 were given to men, whose identity we know nothing of. But Sauron would also try to trick the dwarves and put them under his dominion. To each lord of the 7 houses, a ring was bestowed, though in one version, the ring given to Durin III was given to him by Celebrimbor himself. In any case, the dwarves proved too hardy and resistant to their effects, but the men eventually faded, and in Second Age 2251, they appeared as ring wraiths for the first time, Sauron's greatest slaves and most loyal servants. It was during this period Sauron would style himself with glorious titles, such as King of Kings, King of Men, Lord of the Earth, and even Lord of the World. During this period, a shadow fell upon the Numenorians, and they began to turn their back on the Valar and Eldar, no longer worshipping Eru, and they envied the immortality of the elves. In 3255, Ar-Pharazôn had usurped the throne of Numenor by taking the scepter after the death of Tar Palantir. When he heard of Sauron's titles, he sailed for Middle-earth to challenge him. The proud Numenorians came to Middle-earth with great force of arms and landed at the havens of Umbar. Sauron's forces fled before the mighty army of the Numenorians. Realizing he could not defeat the Numenorians with military strength, Sauron allowed himself to be taken as a hostage to Numenor by King Ar-Pharazôn in Second Age 3262. There he quickly grew from captive to advisor and was known as Sigurd, the wizard in Adonaic, the tongue of the Numenorians. He seduced the king and further corrupted the people. It is he whose name is not now spoken, for the Valar have deceived you concerning him, putting forward the name of Eru, a phantom devised in the folly of their hearts, seeking to enchain men in servitude to themselves, for they are the oracle of this Eru, which speaks only what they will. But he that is their master shall yet prevail, and he will deliver you from this phantom, and his name is Melkor, Lord of all, giver of freedom, and he shall make you stronger than they. He converted many of the Numenorians to worship of darkness, becoming high priest of a Melkor cult. He had the white tree Nimloth cut down, and in its place raised a great temple, in which he performed human sacrifices, persecuting those who were still part of the faithful and other men under Numenor's yoke. Finally, in 3310, he convinced the king to rebel against the Valar and attack Valinor itself, claiming they would gain immortality, which Ar-Pharazôn much desired as he began to get older and feared death. For the next 9 years, they would build the Great Armament, the greatest naval force ever assembled. As Ar-Pharazôn and the Great Armament set sail for Valinor, Sauron remained behind in the Temple of Melkor. As the Numenorians went ashore in Valinor, Eru himself directly intervened. He broke the very world, so it would go from flat to a sphere, and so that men could never again sail to Valinor. In this catastrophe, Ar-Pharazôn's fleet was pulled into the chasm that had opened between the Blessed Realm and the mortal lands, and Numenor sank beneath the sea. Ar-Pharazôn himself, along with the soldiers that had followed him to Valinor, is said to have been buried underground and lies in the caves of the Forgotten until the last battle. Sauron sank into the Sundering Seas, along with the rest of Numenor. However, his spirit survived, although severely weakened and never again able to take a fair form. It fled back to his stronghold in Mordor, where he would soon rise again. From this point on, he started to rule through terror and force, largely filling the fearsome role left vacant by his former master. Meanwhile, a few faithful Numenorians, led by Elendil, were saved from the downfall of Numenor, and they founded Gondor and Arnor in Middle-earth, also known as the Realms in Exile. Sauron slowly but surely regained his strength while preparing his armies for war against the Realms. In 3429, he launched his attack on Gondor. He attacked Minas Ithil, the city built by Isildur, son of Elendil, but Isildur and his family fled the city, along with a sapling of the White Tree. He sailed down the Anduin and to Grey Havens, where he warned Gil-galad and his father about Sauron's attack. The Numenorians formed the last alliance of elves and men with the elven king Gil-galad. While their forces gathered in Eriador, Elendil's other son, Anarion, held back Sauron in Osgiliath, the capital of Gondor at the time, and he even managed to push back Sauron's forces into Mordor. When Sauron learned about the force gathering in the north, he dispatched some orcs of Mordor to the Misty Mountains to ambush them. But this made little to no difference, and more allies joined the forces of the last alliance as they marched towards the Black Gate. He adopted a scorched earth tactic, where he set fire to the lands along the Anduin, including the gardens of the Endwives. This did not stop the army, however, and on the fields of Dagorlad in 3434, a great battle took place, the battle that resulted in the Dead Marshes. Sauron's forces were defeated and fled to barad-dur, that was besieged hereafter. The siege would continue for the next 7 years, and it was during these years that Anarion met his tragic end in 3440. Anarion's helmet was crushed by a thrown rock, resulting in his death. At last, in 3441, Sauron himself came forth from barad-dur to face his enemies. His onslaught was terrible, and the siege was almost broken as Sauron and his host advanced to the slopes of Mount Doom. There he was encountered by the captains of the Alliance, Gil-galad and Elendil, and to their side stood Elrond, Círdan, and Isildur. Gil-galad and Elendil fought Sauron and vanquished him, but both were slain. As Elendil fell, his sword was broken beneath him. Isildur seized the hilt of his father's sword and cut off the ring on which Sauron wore the One Ring. Being bereft of his power, Sauron was no longer able to hold a physical form and perished. Isildur took the ring as a weregild for the death of his father and brother. though Círdan and Elrond advised him to destroy it. And as we know, later the ring betrayed him and was lost for more than 2,000 years. After Sauron's defeat in the War of the Last Alliance, his spirit fled east and hid until he could take a physical form again. It was first around 1,000 years into the Third Age that Sauron would return and once again spread terror in the hearts of his enemies. But that's a story for another day. Thank you all for watching, and special thanks to all the patrons and members of the channel. You make this channel possible. As always, thank you all for watching and being part of the Council of the Rings. Farewell till next time.